I was standing alone in my downtown office, the city pressed against the glass behind me, when I laid the papers out in a neat row on the conference table. Property transfer documents for the waterside cottage. Valued just over $1.1 million. A retirement gift. My daughter's future, set down in ink in margins. I remember smoothing the pages with my palm, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. 40 years of work, finally resolving into something clean and generous. Then my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. I wish I had. The voice was calm, controlled, and brief. A warning. Not to sign anything. Not today. Not these papers. Because they weren't just taking the cottage. They were taking more than that. More than I could see. The call ended before I could respond. I stood there, the pen hovering above the signature line, my name waiting patiently. I told myself it was nothing. A scam. Bad timing. But business instinct doesn't come from paranoia. It comes from survival. And something in my chest tightened hard enough that I set the pen down and stopped everything. What followed dismantled my understanding of loyalty, legacy, and the quiet assumptions I had made about my own family. Before I take you there, I want to ask you something, man to man. If you've ever felt the ground shift beneath something you built with care, stay with me. Subscribe, not because of the story but because none of us carry these moments alone. And if you've lived through a betrayal that arrived quietly, I hope you'll share it in the comments. Sometimes telling it is how we survive. I stood there longer than I care to admit, staring at my phone as if it might ring again out of guilt for what it had just done. The office felt different after that call. Same room, same glass, same city moving on without me, but the air had thickened. Experience teaches you that when a warning arrives without flourish, it deserves respect. I called the number back. What? Straight to silence. Again. Nothing. I tried a third time, slower, deliberate, as if patience might be mistaken for authority. Still nothing. No voicemail. No trace. Just a dead end where a voice had been. I told myself it was a scam. A fishing line cast at the right moment. But timing matters. It always has. And this had arrived at the precise minute my hand was ready to close a 40-year chapter. I have learned, over decades of contracts and closings, that coincidence is rarely innocent. So I did the only responsible thing. I stopped. I slid the documents back into their folders and locked them in the credenza. I canceled the courier. I emailed my assistant and told her no more signatures today, no matter who asked. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. Authority doesn't require reasons when it's earned honestly. Then I sat down and did what I have always done when something doesn't sit right. I reviewed everything. The retirement package was clean at first glance. The cottage transfer papers were standard, prepared by a firm I'd used before. The company share transition documents were orderly, outlining a gradual handoff, protections in place, voting thresholds preserved. The leadership transition plan named my daughter as successor, with advisory oversight for the first year. It was the future I had designed carefully, without haste. I read every page anyway, slowly, twice. Nothing leapt out. No obvious errors. No clumsy overreach. Which bothered me more than if there had been. Real manipulation doesn't announce itself. It hides inside what looks familiar, counting on trust to do the heavy lifting. As the afternoon drained away, I kept returning to the same thought. The voice hadn't asked for anything. No money. No access. No response. Just restraint. Just a warning to pause. People running cons don't tell you to stop. They rush you forward. By early evening, the city outside my window had begun to dim. Office lights blinked on in neighboring buildings like distant signals. I packed up and went home, carrying the unease with me like a briefcase I couldn't set down. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I sat in my home office with the door closed, the phone on the desk in front of me, waiting. Not anxiously. Patiently. The way you wait when you know something unfinished has already decided to return. The call came at 9:30 on the dot. Not a second early, not a second late. That alone told me more than the voice ever could. I answered without greeting. I didn't need one. She spoke my name as if testing its weight, then confirmed I was alone. Her voice was older than I remembered, steadier, sharpened by years that hadn't been kind but had been instructive. She didn't apologize for the warning. She didn't explain it yet. She asked me one question instead, whether I had signed anything after the call. When I said no, she exhaled slowly, like someone setting down a burden they'd been carrying longer than necessary. She told me who she was. A former accountant. One I had fired more than a decade earlier, after an internal scandal that had nearly cost the company its reputation. At the time, I believed she had failed me. I remembered the meeting. The silence. The paperwork. The way her hands had trembled as she cleared out her desk. What I hadn't known then, what she told me now, was that she hadn't been careless. She had been outmaneuvered by people who understood how to hide inside complexity. She paid the price anyway. That kind of thing either ruins you or retools you. In her case, it did the latter. She works in forensic accounting now. The kind of work that lives in footnotes and timing gaps. She told me she had come across something unusual during a buyer's due diligence review for an unrelated transaction. A shell company. Recently formed. Structurally clean. And quietly connected to mine. She said my name had jumped out at her the way a face does in a crowd when you don't expect to see it. Familiar. Unsettling. Worth another look. As she spoke, I said nothing. I let the silence stretch. I have learned that people reveal more when they are not rushed. What she was telling me wasn't speculation. It was pattern recognition. She explained that the shell company had been created months earlier, long before my retirement announcement. It was positioned to negotiate a rapid sale of my business. Quick, quiet, profitable. The kind of exit that only works if control shifts cleanly and protections dissolve at exactly the right moment. Then she said the words that changed the shape of the room. The shell company, she told me, was controlled by my daughter and my son-in-law. I didn't interrupt her. I didn't argue. I didn't deny it. Denial is a luxury for people who don't know how fragile the truth can be. I let her continue. She explained how the documents I was preparing to sign had been altered, not sloppily, not enough to alarm an attorney on a first pass. Just enough. Clauses softened. Safeguards rephrased. A partial handoff reshaped into full control. Once signed, the company would no longer be mine in any meaningful sense. The cottage, she said, wasn't a gift. It was leverage. A way to keep my attention on something sentimental while everything else moved underneath me. By the time she finished, the house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I sat there long after the call ended, my hands folded, my breathing slow, understanding something with painful clarity. This hadn't started today. It had been in motion for months. After the call, sleep wasn't an option. Not because of fear but because my mind had shifted into a mode I knew well. The one that turns emotion down and precision up. I powered on my laptop, poured a glass of water I didn't drink and waited. The file arrived less than 10 minutes later. A digital packet. Organized. Labeled. Clinical. The kind of presentation that doesn't ask you to believe, only to follow. I opened it slowly as if pacing might soften what I was about to see. There were side-by-side comparisons of documents. Original templates next to executed versions. Ownership filings pulled from public registries. Email threads stripped of pleasantries and reduced to intent. Nothing dramatic. Nothing reckless. Just a quiet reconfiguration of control, carried out with patience. The alterations were subtle enough that I understood how they'd slipped through. A word changed here. A reference removed there. A timing clause adjusted so that authority transferred not gradually, but immediately. Reading it, I felt something colder than anger. Respect, not admiration but acknowledgement, for the care taken to do it right. The cottage appeared again, woven into a larger pattern. It wasn't just a gift, it was a moment. A distraction engineered to coincide with the exact window when everything else became vulnerable. While I focused on legacy, they focused on liquidity. Hours passed without my noticing. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its quiet rhythms. Inside, I traced decisions backward, asking myself when the first door had opened. Near dawn I found it. Routine documents. Things I had signed over time without ceremony. Authorizations. Temporary permissions. Operational conveniences granted because I believed trust was still intact. Each one harmless on its own. Together, a skeleton key. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes, not in defeat but in recognition. This hadn't been a single betrayal. It was an accumulation, of access, of assumption, of familiarity weaponized. By the time the sky began to lighten, I knew two things with certainty. First, I was not too late. And second, this would not be handled privately. I made 2 calls that morning. One to my attorney, asking him to clear his day. The other to a private investigator whose name I had been given years earlier and never expected to use. I told neither of them the whole story. Not yet. You don't show your full hand until the table is set. As I ended the second call, I gathered the original papers, the cottage transfer, the retirement documents, the future I had almost given away, and placed them back in their folders. They would still be signed. My attorney didn't ask questions when I told him I needed his full attention. That alone told me he heard something in my voice he hadn't heard before. We met mid-morning in his downtown office, the kind of place where the furniture is chosen for permanence, not style. Legal spaces are built to absorb impact. They expect trouble. I laid everything out. The original documents. The altered versions. The timelines. I watched his face change not with shock but with focus. He didn't interrupt. He read. Compared. Marked pages with small, precise movements, like a surgeon mapping an incision. When he finally looked up, he didn't soften it. This was real. Deliberate. And carefully engineered. He confirmed what I already suspected. The templates were his. Copied, modified, and reintroduced with just enough plausibility to pass a routine review. Whoever had done it understood how the system worked from the inside. Not just legally but culturally. They knew where trust lived and how to borrow it. By early afternoon, the investigator called. He spoke without drama, the way professionals do when they don't need persuasion. My son-in-law's history wasn't clean. Not criminal on the surface but inconsistent. Name variations. Address gaps. Employment overlaps that didn't align. A person who didn't just reinvent himself once but refine the process. More troubling was the financial trail. My daughter hadn't just been named in the shell company. She had been receiving funds tied to the upcoming sale, quiet distributions routed through intermediaries, structured to look like bonuses, consulting fees, anything but what they were. Participation, not ignorance. I felt that one land differently. Not sharper. Heavier. The investigator didn't speculate about motives. He didn't need to. The picture was complete enough on its own. This wasn't opportunism. It was design. And it had required proximity. Years of patience. I thanked him and ended the call. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then my attorney asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't want confrontation yet. I wanted containment. Emergency legal blocks against the shell company. Immediate updates to my estate plan. Nothing public. Nothing visible. A tightening of boundaries so subtle that anyone watching would assume nothing had changed. Then I told him I wanted law enforcement involved, but only when the timing was right. There would be a retirement event. A formal handoff. A room full of witnesses who believed they were attending a celebration. I wanted everything ready by then. That evening, I invited my daughter and her husband to dinner. Just family, I said. Nothing formal. They arrived just after 7, right on time, carrying a bottle of wine they knew I liked because I had introduced it to them years earlier. Familiarity is a tool when used patiently. I let them in, took their coats, moved through the evening the way I always had, measured, unhurried, predictable. That predictability was doing more work than they realized. Dinner was quiet. Comfortable on the surface. We talked about neutral things, the city, travel plans, small inconveniences that pass for intimacy when real topics are avoided. I watched them more than I spoke. The way they exchanged looks before answering certain questions. The way my daughter filled silence that didn't need filling. The way my son-in-law spoke with confidence that never quite reached his eyes. After dessert, I excused myself and stepped into the study, leaving the door ajar. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't need to. The device on my desk was already active, recording without spectacle. Not hidden exactly, just unremarkable. Like so much of what they had relied on. From the next room their voices lowered. They spoke freely then. Not carelessly, but with the ease of people who believed the outcome was settled. They talked about timelines. About patience finally paying off. About how I would feel relieved once everything was handled, and how the sale would come together quickly after the retirement event. They spoke about the cottage as if it were already theirs to reassign, a loose end to be tied once control was secure. There was no malice in their tone. That was the part that stayed with me. No anger. No resentment. Just certainty. As if this were the natural order of things, and I had simply outlived my usefulness. When I returned to the room, the conversation stopped cleanly. Too cleanly. They smiled. Asked if I wanted coffee. I said no. I walked them to the door and thanked them for coming. After they left, I stood alone in the entryway for a long time, listening to the house settle back into itself. The recording device blinked once and went still. I didn't replay it that night. I didn't need to. I already knew what was there. The next morning, I met with my attorney again. We reviewed the recording. We aligned it with the documents. Intent was no longer theoretical. It was documented, contextualized, undeniable. Everything moved quickly after that, but not visibly. Legal holds were placed. Authorities were briefed. Corrected documents were prepared, identical in appearance, fortified in substance. Invitations went out for the retirement event, a celebration of continuity and gratitude. They responded enthusiastically. By the time the hotel ballroom filled with familiar faces and polite applause, every piece was in position. All that remained was timing. The ballroom had been arranged to suggest continuity. Soft lighting. Neutral colors. A long banner with my name beside the company's, paired the way they had been for most of my adult life. People shook my hand and thanked me for years I had already finished giving. I accepted it with the practiced ease of someone who knows when a chapter is ending but hasn't decided how it will be remembered. My daughter sat near the front, composed, attentive, already wearing the posture of leadership. My son-in-law hovered just behind her, greeting investors, smiling at people he believed would soon be answering to him. They were relaxed, confident. Everything was unfolding exactly as they expected. That was the danger of patience. It can look like permission. When it was time for the formal signing, the master of ceremonies invited me to the stage. Applause rose politely, warmly. I felt none of it. My attention was on the table set beside the podium, the familiar folders laid out in their precise order. The corrected documents were there now, indistinguishable from the originals unless you knew exactly where to look. I began by speaking about legacy. About stewardship. About the difference between building something and inheriting it. Nothing accusatory. Nothing sharp. Just truth delivered slowly the way it settles best. Then I invited my daughter forward. She stood, smiling, already anticipating the moment. Cameras lifted. Phones followed. This was supposed to be the clean transfer, the public confirmation of what had already been arranged in private. Instead I paused. I thanked her for her ambition, for her intelligence, for reminding me that trust, once given, must still be guarded. The smile on her face tightened just slightly. Confusion flickered. The room quieted. I explained, calmly, that the documents originally prepared had contained inconsistencies, that a review had uncovered unauthorized alterations, that legal action had already been initiated to preserve the company and protect its employees, its investors, and its future. People shifted in their seats. Murmurs spread like a low tide pulling back. I didn't name names yet. I didn't need to. Authorities stepped forward from the side of the room, not in a rush, not with spectacle. Just presence. My attorney stood beside me, holding the evidence that had already been reviewed and accepted. The recording. The filings. The trail that led exactly where it needed to. My daughter turned toward me then, her expression no longer composed. My son-in-law stepped back instinctively, as if distance might rewrite proximity. I finished by announcing that the company would remain under my control until a lawful, transparent succession could be arranged, that the cottage transfer had been rescinded, that my retirement would proceed, but not at the cost of everything I had built. The applause didn't return. That was fine. This wasn't a performance. As they were escorted from the room, quietly, without resistance, I felt something settle that I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Not relief. Just stillness. The ballroom emptied faster than I expected. Not in panic, just in discomfort. People don't linger when certainty dissolves in front of them. They gather their coats, their impressions, their revised opinions, and they leave quietly, eager to return to lives that still feel predictable. I stayed behind. The chairs were half-stacked by the time I stepped down from the stage. Hotel staff moved efficiently, trained not to notice the emotional residue people leave behind. My attorney spoke briefly with the officers, exchanged documents, nodded once, and then turned to me. There was nothing left to decide. Only things to finish. My daughter did not look back as she was escorted out. That detail mattered more than I expected. Not because I needed remorse, but because it confirmed something I had been avoiding. The story she was telling herself did not include me as a victim. Only as an obstacle. I drove home alone that evening. No radio. No calls. Just the sound of tires on pavement and a city settling into night. The cottage file sat on the passenger seat, heavier than it had any right to be. Not because of its value, but because of what it had been turned into. At home, I poured a drink I didn't finish and sat in the darkened living room. The house felt larger than it had in years. Empty but honest. I thought about how many small decisions had led here, how trust erodes not through betrayal alone, but through silence, convenience, and the assumption that love absolves accountability. Over the next days, the machinery did what machinery does. Accounts were frozen. Charges formalized. Statements issued by people paid to choose words carefully. My role was minimal. I answered questions. I provided documentation. I stayed out of the narrative. That too was intentional. The company stabilized quickly. Employees were reassured. Investors exhaled. The structure I had built held because it had always been designed to withstand weather, just not storms from inside the house. I revised my estate plan again, this time without sentiment. Not punitive. Just precise. Legacy, I learned, is not about who you want to trust. It's about what you are willing to protect when trust fails. Weeks later, I visited the waterside cottage alone. I walked the shoreline at dusk, watched the light settle on the water the way it always had. Nothing there had changed. The place had never asked for loyalty. It had simply waited. I understood then that retirement wasn't about stepping away. In the weeks that followed, people assumed I was resting. That I had finally stepped back, feet up, crisis resolved. I let them believe that. Rest is a word people use when they don't understand what still needs tending. What I was really doing was accounting. Not the kind that shows up on balance sheets, but the kind that happens when a man takes inventory of his life and admits where he had been careless. Not reckless, just human. I replayed moments I had dismissed as harmless. Decisions made because they were easier than uncomfortable conversations. Assumptions built on the idea that time and blood guaranteed alignment. They don't. I met again with my attorney, this time without urgency. We spoke about structures that endure beyond personalities. Independent oversight. Redundant approvals. Succession plans that don't rely on trust alone. He didn't lecture. He understood. Lawyers who last long enough learn that most failures aren't dramatic, they're gradual. The investigator sent a final report. I read it once and archived it. I didn't need to revisit the details. Understanding motive doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it just confirms what you already know. There were messages I didn't answer. Calls I let go to voicemail. Not out of spite. Out of clarity. I had said what needed to be said in the only language that mattered: action. One afternoon, I sat in my home office and removed my daughter's name from a folder labeled Future. It felt neither cruel nor righteous. Just accurate. I replaced it with a blank divider and left it there. Some things aren't meant to be filled immediately. The cottage remained untouched. I visited once more, not to inspect or plan but to sit. To let the place exist without expectation. Watching water move has a way of restoring proportion. It reminds you that permanence is an illusion but continuity is not. I realized then that legacy isn't something you hand off. It's something you steward until the last possible moment, and sometimes, that means knowing when not to pass it on at all. I locked the door behind me as I left, not with finality but with intention. There were still chapters left. Silence has a sound when you stop filling it with excuses. In the days after everything settled, I noticed it everywhere. Between phone rings that didn't come, between mornings that arrived without urgency, between the version of myself I had been and the one I was becoming. My daughter did not contact me. Neither did her husband. Their attorneys did, of course, in language stripped of emotion and padded with conditions. I let my own counsel handle those exchanges. There was nothing left to explain personally. Anything said directly would only invite revision, and I was done negotiating reality. I began spending more time at the office again, not because the company needed me but because I did. Walking the floors reminded me that legacy is not abstract. It's people. Names. Histories. Men and women who had trusted the structure I built to outlast personalities, including my own. Some of them stopped me in hallways. They didn't ask questions. They just nodded. Gratitude doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just stands where panic could have been. At home, I removed photographs from my shelves. Not all of them. Just the ones that no longer reflected truth. I didn't destroy them. I placed them carefully in a box and labeled it with a date, not a name. Memory deserves context even when it hurts. One evening, as the light faded, I realized something quietly unsettling. I felt calm. Not numb. Not hollow. Calm in the way you feel after a long illness breaks and you finally recognize your own breathing again. The betrayal had done its damage, but it had also clarified something I had avoided for years. Peace doesn't come from preserving relationships at any cost. It comes from living without lying to yourself. I adjusted my schedule. Fewer meetings. Longer walks. I began writing again, not for anyone else, just notes. Observations. Reminders of what I had learned the hard way so I wouldn't need to learn it again. Trust slowly returned, but selectively. Carefully. Like light entering a room after you've learned which windows to keep open. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something I owed anyone. What surprised me most was not what I lost but what remained untouched. The routines held. Morning light still found its way across the kitchen floor at the same angle. Coffee still tasted the same. The company still opened its doors each day and did the work it had always done. Life, indifferent and steady, refused to dramatize my private collapse. That steadiness became a kind of instruction. I began meeting with people I had once assumed would always be there. Old partners, retired colleagues, men who had stepped away before I was ready to imagine doing the same. We spoke about things we had never made time for when ambition filled every corner. Regrets were mentioned but never indulged. Mostly we talked about judgment, how it sharpens with age, not because you grow suspicious but because you finally understand cost. One afternoon, while reviewing old files, I found a handwritten note from my daughter dated years earlier. A simple thank you. Earnest. Uncalculated. I sat with it for a long time, letting the contradiction exist. People are not one thing forever. Neither are we. That realization softened something in me without reopening anything I had closed. Accountability doesn't require hatred. Distance doesn't require erasure. I could hold the truth as it was without rewriting the past to justify the present. The legal process moved forward without spectacle. Outcomes were decided in rooms I didn't need to enter. I stayed deliberately absent. Power, I had learned, is often best exercised by restraint. Late one evening, I stood again in my study, the same place where I had first waited for a call that changed everything. The room felt smaller now, not because it had shrunk, but because it no longer held uncertainty. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the city's reflection in the window. There was nothing left to uncover. It was nearly 2 months later when the phone rang again. Not an unknown number this time. Familiar. Too familiar. I let it ring twice longer than necessary before answering, not out of hesitation but preparation. Some conversations change nothing. Others clarify what already has. It was my daughter. Her voice was different. Not composed. Not rehearsed. Stripped down to something closer to what it had been years ago before strategy had entered the room. She didn't apologize, not directly. She didn't accuse either. She spoke about pressure. About fear. About believing she was securing a future rather than dismantling one. Words that circled responsibility without landing on it. I listened. Completely. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her version of events. People need to hear themselves sometimes to understand what they've become. When she finished, she waited. I told her I believed she had convinced herself of many things. That intention doesn't erase method. That love doesn't excuse design. I told her that what hurt most was not the attempted takeover, but the certainty with which she believed I would never notice, or never act. There was silence on the line. Not defensive. Just empty. She asked if there was any way back. I chose my words carefully. Not for effect, but for accuracy. I told her that relationships are rebuilt, not restored. That trust is not a feeling, it's a structure. And that structures take time, proof, and patience. I told her I wasn't closing a door. But I wasn't opening one either. When the call ended, I felt no rush of emotion. No collapse. Just acceptance. Closure doesn't always arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it just acknowledges where you are standing. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the office call that had started everything. Morning came without urgency. After that call, I stopped asking myself what I had lost and began paying attention to what I had kept. I had kept my judgment. That mattered more than pride. Judgment is the last thing to return after betrayal, and the first thing you need if you intend to live honestly afterward. I trusted my instincts again, not the softened versions shaped by family obligation, but the ones that had built something durable from nothing. I kept the company. Not just legally but ethically. It was still what it had always been. A place where people worked without fear of sudden extraction, where value wasn't stripped for speed. The attempted sale had failed, but the larger test, the one about whether my principles would hold under personal pressure, had been answered. I kept the cottage too. Not as an asset, not as leverage, but as a place untouched by intention. I went there one final time before winter settled in, walked the room slowly, and understood that gifts given to preserve peace often become burdens when peace no longer exists. I didn't decide its future then. Some things deserved to wait. What I did not keep was illusion. I no longer believed that love alone protects legacy, or that proximity guarantees loyalty. Those beliefs belong to younger men who haven't yet seen how easily good intentions are folded into someone else's plan. I updated my will one last time, not with anger, not with correction, but with clarity. I chose beneficiaries who had never asked. Institutions that would outlive sentiment. Provisions that rewarded stewardship, not entitlement. There was a quiet dignity in doing that work alone. As winter deepened, I reduced my role at the company gradually, deliberately. Not a handoff, an easing. I trained people who had earned my confidence without expecting inheritance. I watched them step into responsibility without rushing to reshape it. That told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't finished. But I was no longer surrounded by noise pretending to be continuity. Time did what it always does when you stop resisting it. It moved forward without asking permission, and slowly the sharp edges of the past softened into something usable, not forgettable but instructive. Spring returned to the city. The light changed. Mornings felt less weighted. I found myself waking without rehearsing conversations that would never happen again. That alone felt like progress. I stepped fully away from daily operations at the company before summer. No announcement. No ceremony. Just a quiet transition completed the way all good work should be, without disruption. The people who remained didn't scramble. They didn't posture. They simply continued. That was the final confirmation that I had built something independent of my presence, which had always been the real goal. I kept one office downtown, smaller than before, mostly for my own discipline. I liked having a place where thought had boundaries, where reflection wasn't scattered across rooms filled with memory. In that space I read. I wrote. I reviewed nothing urgent and planned nothing aggressive. For the first time, my attention wasn't being spent, it was being invested inward. There were moments of grief, but they arrived honestly, not as ambushes. Grief for what I thought family guaranteed. For the version of myself that believed careful generosity would be reciprocated in kind. I let those moments pass without argument. You don't win anything by denying what shaped you. I saw my daughter once more briefly in a public place. The exchange was civil. Restrained. Not cold, just real. There were no promises made and none needed. Progress doesn't always look like reunion. Sometimes it looks like restraint held equally on both sides. One evening near the water, watching the sun dissolve into reflection, I realized something quietly definitive. Justice had already happened. Not in the arrests or the exposure or the documents corrected at the last moment, but in the preservation of what mattered. My work. My principles. My ability to look at myself without flinching. That is the measure most people never calculate. The final document I signed wasn't dramatic. No audience. No cameras. Just a single page, thin as breath, confirming what had already been true for some time. It wasn't a transfer. It wasn't a surrender. It was a declaration. I stepped down completely on my terms, with safeguards intact and stewardship assigned to people who had never mistaken access for entitlement. I watched the ink settle and felt nothing surge or break inside me. That's how I knew it was right. The important decisions don't arrive with adrenaline. They arrive with quiet certainty. I walked out of the building for the last time just before dusk. The city was unchanged. It didn't pause for me. That felt appropriate. We are meant to leave things standing, not leaning. Weeks later, I returned to the waterside cottage one final time. Not to claim it. Not to give it away. I sat on the deck as evening pulled the light down across the water and understood something I hadn't when this all began. Legacy isn't what you pass on. It's what survives without you. I left the cottage exactly as it was. Locked the door. Let the place rest. Its future would be decided later by clearer hands, without pressure or sentiment clouding the work. I drive less now. Speak less. But I notice more. I notice when instinct whispers instead of shouts. I notice when silence feels earned rather than empty. I notice that peace doesn't come from winning, it comes from refusing to be moved where you no longer belong. The warning call that day saved me more than property. It saved my ending. And endings, I've learned, matter just as much as beginnings. That was the last signature. Everything after that has been my own.